What starts as a routine flight quickly becomes a life-altering journey for Captain Eric Dawson. Faced with an emergency mid-flight, Eric's quick thinking saves lives, but that's just the beginning. He's also forced to confront prejudice head-on, sparking change that goes far beyond the skies. How will Eric's actions ripple through the lives of those around him and the entire aviation industry? Stick around to find out. Comment your thoughts and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Let's get started. Eric Dawson adjusted his grip on his leather carry-on bag as he stepped into the bustling airport terminal. The air was filled with the hum of announcements, the chatter of passengers, and the occasional squeal of suitcase wheels on the polished floor. He loved this environment, the constant movement, the energy of people going places. Yet, as a black man who had spent years in the airline industry, Eric had long learned that even in the most familiar of settings, prejudice could still sneak up on him. Today was supposed to be a break from all that. For once, he wasn't the one piloting the plane. Eric had decided to take a rare vacation, heading to Seattle to visit his sister. The flight, in first class no less, was a small luxury he was treating himself to. After all the years he had spent piloting others to their destinations, it was time for him to just sit back and enjoy the journey. As he approached the first-class check-in line, a sense of pride and excitement filled him. He wasn't an arrogant man, but there was something satisfying about walking to the front of a line. The benefits of hard work and dedication finally paying off. Eric kept his movements relaxed, his tall, broad frame moving through the crowd with ease. He reached the head of the line where a blonde flight attendant stood, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pristine. Her name tag read Kelly Morgan. As she glanced up from her tablet, her smile faltered ever so slightly. She scanned him, her eyes flicking from his face to his tailored suit and expensive watch, her expression shifting from welcoming to something colder, almost suspicious. Eric had seen this look more times than he cared to count. "Excuse me, sir," Kelly said, her voice tight and clipped. "Are you sure you're in the right line? Economy boarding is over there?" She gestured vaguely behind him, the smile on her lips thin and insincere. Eric's heart rate sped up, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew what this was, disdain veiled behind politeness. He had felt it before, in boardrooms, in restaurants, and yes, even at 35,000 feet while working as a commercial airline pilot. Still, he wasn't about to let it ruin his day. Without a word, he calmly handed over his first-class boarding pass. Kelly snatched the pass from him, her manicured nails clicking against the paper. Her eyes flicked to the ticket, widening briefly when she saw his name and seat assignment, then narrowed again. "I see," she muttered, her tone barely hiding her irritation. She handed the pass back, her smile forced. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Dawson." Eric nodded, sliding his boarding pass into his pocket. As he walked past Kelly, he heard her murmur under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear, "I guess they're letting anyone fly first class these days." His shoulders stiffened, but he kept walking. There was no point in engaging with ignorance. Eric had long learned to pick his battles, and this was one of them. Still, her words sat heavy on him as he made his way down the jet bridge. The excitement for the trip momentarily dampened. Behind him, a group of flight attendants near the gate desk whispered to each other. One of them, a younger man with kind eyes, frowned as he watched the interaction. "Did you see that he whispered to the woman beside him? That was way out of line." The woman shrugged, her eyes darting nervously towards Kelly. "You know how she can be," she muttered. "Not our place to say anything." Eric stepped into the first-class cabin and found his seat easily. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, the familiar motion bringing a small sense of comfort. As he sat down, the plush leather seat embracing him, he closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He wouldn't let one ignorant flight attendant ruin his day. He had dealt with far worse during his career. The hum of the engines as they prepared for takeoff filled the cabin, a sound that was music to Eric's ears. He had spent more hours in the air than most people could imagine. The cockpit was like a second home to him. It took years of dedication, countless late nights studying and navigating the complexities of the aviation world to get where he was. There were times when people like Kelly had doubted him, judging him by the color of his skin rather than his qualifications. But he had persevered. He always did. As the plane began to taxi, Eric noticed the glance of another flight attendant, a younger woman named Melissa, who moved through the aisle with a professional air. She didn't linger on him like Kelly had, but there was something different in her demeanor, something kinder. He appreciated that. It was those small gestures that could make all the difference in moments like this. For now, Eric decided to focus on what lay ahead, a week of relaxation, catching up with his sister, and enjoying the break he had earned. He reached for the in-flight magazine in the seat pocket in front of him, preparing to pass the time until they reached cruising altitude. But before he could lose himself in the pages, Kelly reappeared, pushing a cart with drinks and snacks. Her demeanor had shifted, her smile now warm and friendly as she served the elderly couple seated across from him. "Good afternoon," Kelly chirped, leaning in to listen attentively as the couple ordered their drinks. She poured them with meticulous precision, her tone syrupy sweet. Eric kept his focus on the magazine, though he knew what was coming. As Kelly approached his row, her smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation. Without a word, she slapped a napkin onto his tray table and placed a plastic cup of water in front of him. The abruptness of her movements caused some of the water to slosh over the rim. "Thank you," Eric said calmly, reaching for the cup. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Kelly snorted, barely concealing her contempt, and moved on without a word. From the aisle, the younger attendant, Melissa, watched the interaction with concern. She hesitated, glancing towards Eric with an apologetic expression, before turning back to her duties. Further down the aisle, passengers exchanged uneasy looks. The elderly couple who had been so warmly greeted by Kelly moments earlier whispered to each other, shaking their heads. "It's a shame," the woman murmured to her husband. "He seems like a nice man." The husband nodded, his expression troubled. Someone ought to say something, but no one did. Just like so many other times, Eric found himself alone with his thoughts, bearing the weight of their silent judgments. He had become used to it, the quiet, uncomfortable stares, the unspoken assumptions, the moments when people saw his skin before they saw him. The plane ascended smoothly, breaking through the clouds and settling into cruising altitude. Eric leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes again, hoping that once the service was over, the tension in the cabin might ease. He wasn't here to make a point, to prove himself to anyone. He was just another passenger looking forward to a vacation. That's what he reminded himself, though it was easier said than done. As the flight went on, the tension remained, a quiet current running beneath the otherwise calm atmosphere of the first-class cabin. Kelly's interactions with the other passengers were starkly different from her treatment of Eric, and it wasn't lost on those around them. Whispers spread, glances were exchanged, but no one stepped forward to confront the issue directly. Eric stayed silent, his face impassive, his emotions locked behind a practiced calm. But inside, something simmered, a quiet frustration that he had carried for years. A frustration that came not from a single slight, but from the accumulation of moments like these, where he was reminded again and again that no matter how high he flew, there were always those who would try to bring him down. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, the hum of the engines providing a rhythmic backdrop as the flight attendants finished the initial service rounds. Eric sat back, his gaze occasionally wandering out the window, though his mind wasn't entirely on the view. The interactions with Kelly still lingered in his thoughts, but he reminded himself that this was a familiar frustration. He had dealt with worse over the years. Still, it gnawed at him, the quiet, lingering sting of being reduced to a stereotype before he'd even had a chance to say a word. Across the aisle, Martha and Frank, the elderly couple who had noticed Kelly's behavior earlier, sat quietly, their hands intertwined. Martha, a spry woman with silver hair and soft features, glanced over at Eric from time to time. Her eyes were kind, concerned. Frank, who had an air of quiet wisdom about him, seemed equally unsettled by what they'd seen. Yet, like everyone else, they remained silent. "Do you think we should say something?" Martha whispered, her voice just loud enough for Frank to hear, but quiet enough to avoid drawing attention. Frank sighed, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "It's not our place, love," he replied softly. "These things are complicated. Best we stay out of it." Martha frowned but nodded, her eyes returning to her book. Yet she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling over her. She had always believed in standing up for what was right, but the weight of social norms and the discomfort of confrontation kept her in her seat, just like so many others. Further down the aisle, David, the co-pilot, stepped out of the cockpit for a moment, his face slightly pale. He walked past the first-class cabin on his way to the bathroom, his mind clearly preoccupied with something more than the usual mid-flight duties. Eric noticed David's brief glance at Kelly as she moved down the aisle, refilling drinks and handing out snacks, her demeanor still stiff and unwelcoming when she passed him. The co-pilot's expression was unreadable, but something in the way he moved hinted at more going on than met the eye. Eric took a deep breath, trying to let go of the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't here to make waves. He wasn't here to confront Kelly or demand an apology, though part of him wanted to. Had long since learned that addressing ignorance in the moment often led nowhere productive. But the quiet disrespect still hung in the air, the kind of thing that lingered and soured what should have been a peaceful journey. Melissa, the younger flight attendant who had been polite but reserved earlier, passed by again, offering drinks to the passengers. As she reached Eric's row, she hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking toward Kelly before returning to him. There was an apology in her gaze, unspoken but clear. She didn't say anything directly, but when she handed him a fresh cup of water, she did so with a quiet, respectful nod. "Anything else I can get for you, sir?" she asked, her tone soft, almost cautious. Eric shook his head, offering her a small, appreciative smile. "No, thank you," he replied. It was something deeper, something more insidious. Her interaction, though brief, was a balm to the tension. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, but sometimes it was the smallest gestures that mattered the most. As the flight settled into a quiet rhythm, Eric found himself drifting between thoughts and the steady sound of the engines. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the other passengers were either reading, dozing, or engaged in light conversation. Martha and Frank exchanged occasional words, their conversation hushed and intimate, while the businessman in the row ahead of Eric worked diligently on his laptop, his gaze fixed on the screen as though determined to block out the world around him. But Eric's attention was pulled back to Kelly as she made her way through the cabin again, this time with a tray of snacks. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her smile plastered on, but never quite reaching her eyes when she looked in Eric's direction. When she reached the row beside his, her attitude shifted again. She leaned in with an almost performative warmth as she offered snacks to a well-dressed woman in her 50s. "Anything else I can get for you?" Ma'am. Kelly's voice was sickly sweet, dripping with forced charm. The woman glanced at Eric, her eyes flickering with a brief uncertainty. She had seen Kelly's cold behavior toward him earlier, and now, faced with Kelly's over-the-top kindness, she seemed momentarily conflicted. "No, thank you," the woman said quietly, her gaze dropping to the magazine in her lap, as if to avoid further interaction. As Kelly moved on, her voice lowered, but not enough to escape Eric's notice. "I didn't realize they were handing out first-class seats in charity raffles now," she muttered, a smirk playing on her lips as she shot a glance in Eric's direction. It was too much. Eric's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his seat. He had endured a lifetime of small slights, of microaggressions and blatant discrimination, but something about being trapped in this space at 35,000 feet with no way to escape made it all the more suffocating. He considered saying something. He could confront her, call out her behavior for what it was. Part of him wanted to stand up and demand the respect he deserved. But he knew how these situations played out. He had been here before. Speaking up would make him the angry black man, the one causing a scene. No matter how justified his anger might be, the perception would shift, and suddenly, the issue wouldn't be Kelly's behavior, it would be his reaction to it. Instead, he took a deep breath, focusing on the hum of the engines, the familiar sound that had always centered him. He was here to relax, to enjoy his vacation, and he wasn't going to let her ignorance take that from him. Unbeknownst to Kelly, Others had begun to notice her behavior. Martha leaned over to Frank again, her voice a little more insistent this time. "Did you hear that she whispered? What she said about him?" Frank nodded slowly, his face tightening. "I heard it. It's disgraceful." "We should do something," Martha urged, her voice trembling slightly. "We can't just sit here and watch." But again, Frank hesitated. He wasn't a confrontational man by nature, and like many others in the cabin, he was unsure of how to intervene. He glanced at the businessman in the row ahead, wondering if he'd noticed too, but the man remained focused on his laptop, deliberately keeping his head down. Toward the back of the first-class cabin, Alex, the young flight attendant with the kind eyes, watched the interaction unfold from his position near the galley. His frown deepened, and for a moment it seemed as though he might step in. But like so many others, he hesitated. He threw Eric an apologetic glance, a silent acknowledgement of the unfairness of the situation, but it wasn't enough to push him to act. The tension in the cabin grew thicker with each passing moment. Kelly's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed by many of the passengers, and while no one said anything, there was a palpable discomfort in the air. It was the kind of tension that came from seeing something wrong, but feeling powerless, or too afraid to intervene. As the flight continued on, Eric leaned back in his seat, trying to let the frustration slip away. But beneath his calm exterior, something was building, something that had been building for years. It wasn't just about Kelly, though she was certainly the catalyst. It was about all the Kellys he had encountered throughout his life, people who saw him as less than, who judged him before he had the chance to prove otherwise. I promise. Tired of always having to be the bigger person. Tired of holding his tongue to avoid making others uncomfortable. Tired of fighting for the respect he had already earned 1,000 times over. But as he sat there, surrounded by passengers who either didn't notice or didn't care enough to act, Eric decided he wouldn't let Kelly win it today. Not in the sky, not in this moment, when he had so much more to give. The plane had been in the air for over an hour, cruising smoothly above the clouds. The tension that hung in the first-class cabin persisted, but Eric tried his best to push it aside. He focused on the rhythmic hum of the engines, a sound that usually soothed him, a reminder of all the hours he had spent piloting planes like this one. However, today, even that familiar comfort couldn't fully shake the lingering bitterness of Kelly's words. As he sipped his water, Eric's finely tuned instincts began to kick in. Something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a slight shift in the vibration of the plane. A subtle change in the way the engines sounded. To the untrained ear, it would have been unnoticeable, but to someone like Eric, who had spent years in the cockpit, it was enough to raise a red flag. He glanced around the cabin, scanning the faces of the other passengers. Everyone seemed calm. Most people were either reading, sleeping, or watching movies. Even Kelly, who had been so unpleasant earlier, was moving methodically through her duties, her frosty demeanor still intact, but now directed at no one in particular. Eric's attention shifted back to the engine noise. It had changed again, this time slightly louder, more strained. Something was wrong. His eyes darted to the overhead panel, where the fasten seatbelt sign remained unlit. He frowned. Normally, turbulence or mechanical issues would prompt the flight crew to issue a warning or make an announcement, but so far, everything had been eerily silent. Just as he was about to hit the call button for one of the attendants, the plane lurched violently. Passengers gasped as the aircraft dropped suddenly, sending a wave of panic rippling through the cabin. Eric gripped the armrests of his seat as a few overhead compartments creaked open, bags tumbling out and hitting the floor with dull thuds. A child somewhere in economy began to cry, and whispers of concern filled the first-class cabin. Frank, the elderly man across the aisle, clutched the armrest of his seat as Martha leaned forward, her face pale. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eric's instincts screamed at him that something more than routine turbulence was happening. He kept his eyes focused on the cockpit door, waiting for any sign of the flight crew. The intercom crackled to life, and a tense voice, the co-pilot's, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and we'll be through it shortly." Thank you." His voice was calm, but Eric could detect the strain beneath the surface. He had been in enough emergency situations to know when a pilot was downplaying an issue to keep passengers calm. This was more than minor turbulence. Eric fastened his seatbelt and glanced around the cabin again. The other passengers were visibly shaken, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Martha was clutching Frank's hand, whispering something to him, while across the aisle, the businessman had snapped his laptop shut and was looking around nervously. Just then, Eric noticed a flight attendant rush toward the front of the plane, her face pale and her movements frantic. It wasn't Kelly or Melissa, but another attendant he hadn't seen earlier, her expression betraying her concern. She disappeared into the galley near the cockpit, and Eric strained to hear the conversation. He caught snippets of hushed, urgent whispers, the kind that only made situations like this worse. His gut told him something serious was happening up front. Had spent enough time in cockpits to know when things were going south. Moments later, Kelly hurried past Eric's row, her usually cool demeanor replaced with a rigid tension. She was walking fast, her posture stiff, her eyes wide. She didn't even glance at Eric as she made her way up the aisle and ducked into the galley, joining the other attendants. Eric's heart began to pound in his chest, his pilot instincts screaming louder than ever. He knew that if the pilots were dealing with an emergency, the crew would be scrambling to manage the situation while keeping the passengers calm. But it wasn't the normal turbulence that worried him. It was the feeling that something much more critical was unfolding in the cockpit. His suspicions were confirmed when Melissa hurried past him, this time not even attempting to hide her anxiety. As she entered the galley, Eric overheard a snippet of her conversation with Kelly and the other attendants. "The captain, he's collapsed," Melissa whispered urgently. "He's completely unresponsive, and David is trying to handle everything alone, but he's overwhelmed. There's turbulence ahead, and we need to land as soon as possible." Eric's breath caught in his throat. The captain was incapacitated. The co-pilot was flying solo. He knew just how dangerous that could be, especially if there was turbulence ahead. A single pilot managing both the controls and the emergency procedures was a recipe for disaster. Without hesitation, Eric unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He knew he was just a passenger on this flight, but he wasn't about to sit idly by while the situation escalated. He was a commercial airline pilot with years of experience, and he couldn't ignore that fact when lives were at risk. He walked quickly toward the galley, his footsteps steady and purposeful. When he reached the group of flight attendants, they turned to him, startled by his sudden presence. Melissa's face was pale with fear, and even Kelly, who had treated him with such disdain earlier, looked shaken. "Excuse me," Eric said, his voice calm but firm. "I overheard what's happening. I'm a commercial airline pilot, and I have experience in handling situations like this. Let me help." Kelly's eyes widened, her expression immediately turning to disbelief. She blinked at him, as if she couldn't process the fact that the man she had looked down on only hours ago was offering to assist in a life-or-death emergency. "You," she scoffed, her voice dripping with skepticism. "You're a pilot." Eric met her gaze steadily, unfazed by her reaction. "Yes, I've been flying commercial planes for over a decade. We don't have time to argue about this. Every second we waste puts everyone on this plane in greater danger." The urgency in his voice seemed to cut through some of the resistance, but Kelly still hesitated, her prejudice clearly at war with the reality of the situation. She opened her mouth, as if to protest, but Melissa interrupted. "Occupation?" he asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "If he can help, we need him." Kelly looked torn, but before she could say anything more, the intercom crackled again. "This is your co-pilot speaking. We're going to encounter some turbulence, but we are handling the situation. Please remain seated, and we'll provide more updates shortly." Eric could hear the stress in David's voice, the way it wavered under the pressure. He couldn't wait any longer. He turned to Melissa, who had stepped forward, clearly the more reasonable of the two. "I need to speak with the co-pilot now," Eric said firmly. "There's no time to waste." Melissa nodded, glancing at Kelly before turning to the cockpit door. Kelly still looked resistant, but the gravity of the situation finally broke through her disbelief. She stepped aside as Melissa keyed in the security code to open the cockpit door. As the door swung open, Eric stepped inside, immediately assessing the situation. The cockpit was in a state of barely controlled chaos. The captain lay slumped in his seat unconscious, while David, the co-pilot, was frantically trying to stabilize the plane as turbulence began to rattle the aircraft. David looked up as Eric entered, his eyes wide with desperation and relief. "Thank God," he breathed. "Are you the pilot?" Eric nodded, already moving toward the controls. "Eric Dawson. I've been flying for 12 years. Let's get this under control." David quickly briefed him on the situation, the captain's sudden collapse, the unexpected turbulence ahead, and their current fuel levels. Eric listened intently as he slid into the captain's seat, his hands moving across the controls with practiced ease. "First things first," Eric said, his voice steady and authoritative. "We need to stabilize the plane and get out of this turbulence. Then, well, figure out the nearest airport for an emergency landing." David nodded, visibly relaxing as Eric took charge. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been trying to manage everything, but it's been overwhelming." Eric offered a brief but reassuring smile. "We've got this. Let's focus on getting everyone on the ground safely." As the plane rattled and shook, Eric's hands worked confidently over the controls. He could feel the weight of the moment, the responsibility of hundreds of lives resting in his hands. But this was what he did. This was who he was. The cockpit was awash in the glow of warning lights and flashing indicators as Eric settled into the captain's seat. The steady vibration of the plane, combined with the rising intensity of the turbulence, filled the small space with a palpable tension. But for Eric, the chaos wasn't a cause for panic, it was a call to focus. He had been in critical situations before, and he knew that the difference between success and failure came down to clear-headed decision-making. "What's our current altitude?" Eric asked, his voice steady and commanding as his hands worked over the controls. 35,000 feet, David replied, his voice still shaky but regaining composure. "But this turbulence is rougher than expected. We're off our flight path slightly, and I haven't had time to contact air traffic control about an emergency landing." Eric nodded, quickly assessing the situation. "All right, let's stabilize the plane first." Helen could hear his voice echoing down the hall, sharp and unrelenting as he laid out his grievances. He adjusted the autopilot settings, making small but crucial changes to the plane's altitude and heading. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky was a swirling mass of clouds, but he knew that once they dropped a few thousand feet, they would likely find smoother air. The plane shuddered again, harder this time, and the overhead compartments rattled in the cabin behind them. David wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. "I didn't think it would be this bad. The turbulence wasn't supposed to last this long." "These weather systems can be unpredictable," Eric replied calmly, his fingers flying over the instrument panel. "But we're going to get through this. Let's start descending." He guided the plane into a gradual descent, dropping the altitude by several thousand feet. The turbulence, though still present, began to ease as they moved to a lower altitude, the plane's movements smoothing out slightly. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough for now. David let out a long breath of relief. "I don't know how you're staying so calm," he admitted, glancing at Eric with admiration. Eric allowed himself a brief smile. "Experience. We've got this under control." David nodded, clearly grateful for the help. "Thank you. I wasn't sure how much longer I could manage everything on my own." Eric gave him a reassuring look. "You did fine. These situations are tough, even for seasoned pilots." As the plane steadied, Eric turned his attention to the next problem, the captain. He glanced over at the unconscious man, slumped in his seat, his face pale. The captain's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but he was completely unresponsive. It was clear that the situation was serious, and getting the plane safely on the ground was their only option. "How's the captain?" Eric asked, his eyes flicking back to the instruments. David shook his head, worry etched on his face. "Not good. He collapsed about 20 minutes ago, and we haven't been able to wake him. We're guessing it's a heart attack, but we can't be sure without medical help." Eric grimaced. Time wasn't on their side. They needed to land as soon as possible. "We'll get him the help he needs," Eric said firmly. Let's contact ATC and request an emergency landing. David reached for the radio, his hand trembling slightly as he tuned to the appropriate frequency. This is Flight 293, declaring an emergency. We have an incapacitated captain and are requesting immediate clearance for an emergency landing. We are currently descending to 28,000 feet. Please advise on the nearest available airport. The radio crackled with static for a few moments before the calm voice of the air traffic controller came through. Flight 293, we copy your emergency. The nearest airport is Denver International. You are cleared for an emergency descent and approach to runway 16R. Winds are at 12 knots, with gusts up to 20. Well, have emergency services standing by. Copy that, Denver, David replied, a note of relief in his voice. He glanced at Eric. We've got clearance to land. Good, Eric said, adjusting the flight path accordingly. Now let's focus on getting everyone down safely. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the tension had not gone unnoticed by the passengers. Martha and Frank, who had been quiet since the plane first lurched, now exchanged worried glances. I think something's wrong with the pilot, Martha whispered, her voice trembling. I heard the flight attendant talking to that man earlier, Frank replied, his voice low. She said the captain collapsed. I think he's trying to help. Martha's eyes widened. The man from earlier, the one in the suit. Yes, Frank nodded. Has a pilot too. He must be helping in the cockpit. Martha let out a shaky breath. Thank God for that. A few rows behind them, the businessman who had been engrossed in his laptop was now sitting tensely, his hands clenched around the armrests. He had overheard snippets of conversation and pieced together that something was very wrong. But like the others, he remained silent, choosing not to engage in what he didn't fully understand. Toward the back of the first-class cabin, Kelly paced nervously. Her earlier confidence, her cold attitude toward Eric, had evaporated completely. Now she looked lost, uncertain, as if she was trying to process the fact that the man she had treated with such disdain was now in the cockpit, potentially saving everyone's lives. Melissa, ever the calm presence, tried to reassure the passengers as she made her way through the aisles, offering quiet words of comfort. She too was shaken, but she knew that keeping the passengers calm was crucial. Everything will be fine, Melissa told the elderly woman seated near the front of the cabin, her voice soft and soothing. Our pilots are experienced, and they're handling the situation. Please just remain seated and keep your seatbelt fastened. The woman nodded nervously, gripping her husband's hand tightly as they both tried to keep their fear at bay. In the cockpit, Eric and David worked in perfect sync, their movements coordinated and efficient. As they began their final descent toward Denver, Eric monitored the wind speeds and adjusted their approach angle to compensate for the gusts. They were entering the most critical phase of the flight, and every decision had to be precise. We're about 15 minutes out from landing, Eric said, his eyes scanning the control panel. Let's start our approach. David nodded, his confidence restored now that Eric had taken the lead. Gear down, he called, following protocol as the plane's landing gear deployed with a low hum. Eric kept his eyes on the horizon, watching as the lights of Denver International came into view through the cloud cover. His focus was razor-sharp. Despite the chaos that had surrounded them for the past hour, he was fully in his element now, his training and experience kicking in, as if this were just another routine landing. Flaps down, Eric instructed, his voice steady. Flaps down, David confirmed, adjusting the controls as they lined up with the runway. Outside the cockpit, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Passengers clung to their armrests, their knuckles white with anxiety. The turbulence had mostly subsided, but the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on everyone. Some whispered quiet prayers, while others sat in silence, their eyes glued to the windows as the city lights below grew closer and closer. Kelly stood at the front of the cabin, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked out at the passengers, many of whom had no idea how close they had come to disaster. Her gaze flicked toward the cockpit door, and for the first time that day, she felt a deep, uncomfortable pang of regret. She had judged Eric from the moment he stepped onto the plane, dismissed him, and treated him with disrespect. And now, it was his steady hands guiding them through the sky, bringing them all to safety. As the plane descended to its final approach, Eric made one last adjustment to compensate for the crosswind. The runway lights stretched out before them like a glowing path, and Eric's hands moved confidently over the controls. 100 feet, David called, his voice calm now, fully trusting in Eric's leadership. 50 feet, Eric responded, his focus narrowing to the moment of touchdown. The plane glided smoothly toward the runway, and with a gentle bump, the wheels touched down on the tarmac. The plane's engines roared as Eric engaged the thrust reversers, slowing the aircraft to a safe speed. The runway lights flashed by in a blur as they rolled to a gradual stop. The cabin erupted in applause, passengers cheering in relief and gratitude. Eric and David exchanged a brief look of accomplishment, the weight of the moment settling over them. They had done it. Against the odds, they had brought the plane safely to the ground. Back in the cabin, the mood had shifted entirely. Tears of relief flowed, and passengers hugged each other, some whispering prayers of thanks. Martha turned to Frank, her eyes bright with emotion. "We're safe," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're safe." At the front of the cabin, Kelly stood frozen, her expression unreadable as she watched the passengers cheer. Her gaze drifted to the cockpit door, where Eric would soon emerge. The man she had underestimated, dismissed, and insulted had just saved her life and the lives of everyone else on board. The cabin was filled with a mixture of relieved sighs, murmured prayers, and the occasional cheer. Eric took a deep breath as he finished the final checklist with David. The plane had landed safely, and while the emergency wasn't over yet, the hardest part was behind them. Emergency vehicles were already racing toward the aircraft, their lights flashing in the distance as they prepared to assist the unconscious captain and ensure the passengers disembarked safely. "You did it," David said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Eric. I don't know what would have happened without you." Eric gave a modest smile, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We did it together. You kept your head when things got rough, and that's what matters." David shook his head, still amazed. "You stepped in like it was just another day at the office. I've never seen anyone so calm under pressure." Eric appreciated the compliment, but there was no time to dwell on it. He glanced back toward the cabin door, already preparing himself for what awaited outside. His heart was still racing from the adrenaline, and the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. Lives had been on the line, and he had been the one to steer them all to safety. David keyed the intercom, his voice still shaky but now filled with a sense of relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We've made a safe emergency landing at Denver International Airport. Please remain seated until the emergency personnel arrive and guide us through the next steps. We appreciate your cooperation and thank you for your patience." In the cabin, the announcement was met with a fresh wave of applause. Passengers clapped and cheered, many exchanging looks of disbelief and gratitude. Some had tears in their eyes, while others simply sat back, processing the magnitude of what they had just survived. At the front of the first-class cabin, Kelly stood frozen, her arms crossed tightly as the noise of celebration filled the air around her. She watched in silence as the passengers in her section stood and stretched, clearly relieved to be safely on the ground. Eric. She couldn't stop thinking about him. The man she had treated so dismissively, the man she had silently insulted, had just saved her life, and the lives of everyone else on board. Her stomach churned with regret and shame as she remembered her snide comments, her arrogant dismissal of him when he first offered to help. She had been so quick to judge him, and now she was left with the bitter taste of her own prejudice. As she stood there, the cockpit door opened, and Eric stepped out. His expression was calm, but there was a weight to his movements, the weight of someone who had just shouldered a great responsibility and come out the other side. He scanned the cabin, and for a moment his eyes locked with Kelly's. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. Her throat was dry and words failed her. Passengers immediately began approaching Eric, offering handshakes, pats on the back, and words of gratitude. Martha and Frank were the first to reach him. "Thank you, sir," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." Martha wiped a tear from her eye. "We were so scared, but you were calm the whole time. I can't even imagine what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Eric smiled warmly at the elderly couple, grateful for their kind words. "I'm just glad I could help," he said humbly. "We had a great co-pilot up there too, and the crew did a good job keeping everyone calm." As he spoke, more passengers gathered around, offering their thanks and admiration. The businessman, who had remained silent and focused on his laptop for most of the flight, now stepped forward, shaking Eric's hand firmly. "You're a hero," he said simply, his usual businesslike demeanor softened by the gravity of the situation. "I just did what needed to be done," Eric replied, downplaying the hero label. He wasn't looking for glory, just the satisfaction of knowing that everyone was safe. As the crowd around Eric grew, Kelly stood at the edge, watching in silence. Every word of praise for him felt like a slap in the face to her conscience. She had misjudged him so badly, let her own biases cloud her judgment, and now she didn't know how to fix it. Finally, she forced herself to move. Her feet felt heavy as she walked toward Eric, pushing through the crowd until she stood in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eric's face was calm but unreadable as he looked at her, clearly aware of the inner turmoil written across her face. Kelly swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Eric," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to apologize." The noise of the passengers around them quieted as people began to realize what was happening. Kelly felt the weight of their eyes on her, but she pressed on, knowing that this was a moment she couldn't avoid. "I was wrong," Kelly continued, her voice trembling. "I misjudged you. I treated you unfairly, and I made assumptions about you that were completely unjustified. I can't believe I said the things I did." She paused, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Eric remained silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. She could feel the tension between them, a tension born not just from the events of the day, but from something much deeper, something that went beyond this one flight, beyond this one interaction. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you for your apology," he said quietly. "But this goes beyond just me. The way you treated me reflects a larger issue, one that affects a lot of people every day. It's not enough to just apologize. You have to be willing to look at why you made those assumptions in the first place." Kelly's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. I know I need to do better. I need to change." Eric's expression softened, though his words remained measured. "Change is possible," he said, "but it takes more than words. It takes action, and it takes acknowledging the biases we all carry." Kelly nodded again, wiping her eyes. "I promise he'll work on it. It'll be better." Eric gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "I hope so." As Kelly stepped back, Melissa approached, offering Eric a warm, genuine smile. "I can't thank you enough for what you did," she said. "You saved all of us, and I'm so grateful." Eric smiled, appreciating her sincerity. "You did a great job keeping the passengers calm," he replied. "It wasn't easy, but you held it together." Melissa nodded, clearly touched by his words. "I just wanted to make sure everyone was okay. And now, thanks to you, they are." Meanwhile, emergency personnel had arrived, and the medical team quickly boarded the plane to tend to the unconscious captain. The flight attendants began preparing the passengers for disembarkation, guiding them to gather their belongings and follow the crew's instructions. As Eric stood near the front of the cabin, watching the emergency crew work, the airline's ground operations manager, Tom Harris, boarded the plane. A middle-aged man with a non-nonsense demeanor, Tom was clearly the one in charge of coordinating the emergency response. He spotted Eric and immediately approached him, his face filled with gratitude. "Mr. Dawson, I'm Tom Harris, head of ground operations here at Denver International," he said, extending his hand. "I want to personally thank you for what you did today. You saved everyone on board, and we owe you a great debt." Eric shook his hand firmly. "I'm just glad I was in a position to help," he said. "I'm a pilot, it's what I'm trained to do." Tom nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, your calm under pressure saved this flight from what could have been a catastrophe. The airline will be reaching out to you soon, but in the meantime, if there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." Eric nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate that." As the passengers began to disembark, many of them stopped to thank Eric one more time before leaving the plane. The young mother with her toddler clutched his hand tightly as she passed him, tears in her eyes. "You're a real hero," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing us home." The little boy beside her looked up at Eric, his eyes wide with awe. "Are you a superhero?" he asked innocently. Eric chuckled, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Not quite," he said with a smile, "but I'm glad I could help." As the last of the passengers exited the plane, Eric finally allowed himself to breathe a little easier. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp during the emergency was starting to wear off, leaving him feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He made his way to the exit where Tom Harris was waiting. "We'll get you set up with a hotel for the night," Tom said. "And once things settle down, I'm sure the airline will want to debrief you and thank you properly." Eric nodded, ready for some rest after the long and stressful day. But as he stepped off the plane and into the cool evening air, he couldn't help but reflect on what had transpired. The day had been filled with tension, prejudice, and danger, but in the end, he had shown what he was capable of, both as a pilot and as a person. And as the city lights of Denver sparkled in the distance, Eric knew that this was just about landing a plane. It was about challenging assumptions, confronting prejudice, and proving once again that character and skill should always come before appearances. The sun was just beginning to set over the Denver skyline as Eric stepped off the plane, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. His body was still humming with the adrenaline that had carried him through the emergency landing, but now, as he stood on solid ground, the weight of the day began to settle in. He had saved the passengers, helped avert a disaster, and yet there was a deeper unease within him. This day had not only tested his abilities as a pilot, but had also forced him to confront the simmering undercurrent of prejudice that had been present since he boarded the plane. As he made his way into the terminal, Tom Harris, the head of ground operations, walked alongside him. "We've arranged a hotel for you, Mr. Dawson," Tom said, his tone respectful. "The airline wants to make sure you're comfortable tonight, and we'll be in touch soon to properly thank you for everything you did." Eric gave a nod, his mind still racing. "Thank you. I appreciate it." Tom glanced at him, sensing that something was on his mind. "You did a great thing today, Eric. Everyone is safe because of you." "I'm glad everyone's safe," Eric replied, his voice quiet. "But today wasn't just about landing the plane. There's more to address." Tom looked puzzled for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I assume you're talking about the way you were treated before all this went down." Eric's expression hardened just slightly, but he remained calm. "Yes, that flight attendant, Kelly, she made it clear from the moment I boarded that I didn't belong in first class. I can't pretend that didn't happen, even though I'm used to dealing with it." Tom sighed, looking uncomfortable. "I understand. I can't speak for Kelly, but I assure you, the airline will take this seriously. We have zero tolerance for discrimination." Eric appreciated Tom's words, but he had heard similar promises before. Still, this wasn't the moment to push too hard. The exhaustion from the day was starting to catch up with him, and he knew there would be time for further conversations later. "I hope so," Eric said, his voice firm but measured. "Because if the only thing that changes after today is that the plane landed safely, then we've missed a bigger opportunity." After a brief conversation with Tom, Eric was escorted through the terminal toward the hotel shuttle. The terminal was relatively quiet now, with only a few late-night travelers milling about. But even in the stillness, Eric could feel the weight of what had happened on the flight. The eyes of the passengers, the relief in their voices as they thanked him, and the look of regret on Kelly's face, it all lingered with him. As he waited for the shuttle, Eric's phone buzzed. It was a message from Lisa, his wife. "Lisa, I saw the news. Are you okay? The kids and I are worried." Eric smiled softly at the message. Lisa had always been his rock, supporting him through the highs and lows of his career. He quickly typed a response. "Eric, I'm okay. It's been a long day, but everyone's safe. I'll call you as soon as I'm settled." He hit send and took a deep breath, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. He knew Lisa would have a lot of questions, but she also knew how to give him space to process things on his own terms. The hotel shuttle arrived, and within minutes, Eric was checked into his room, a modest but comfortable suite overlooking the quiet Denver skyline. He dropped his carry-on bag by the door and sank into the chair by the window, his mind replaying the events of the day. The hum of the emergency landing still buzzed in his veins, but it was Kelly's face, her awkward apology, that kept coming back to him. Her words had been genuine enough, but Eric knew that apologies, while important, weren't the end of the story. He had spent his entire career navigating the invisible barriers placed in front of him because of his skin color. Kelly's behavior was just one example of the systemic biases that still existed in his field and in society as a whole. As Eric stared out at the twinkling lights of the city, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from the airline's senior operations manager, David Knox. Subject, thank you and next steps. Dear Mr. Dawson, on behalf of the entire airline, I want to extend our deepest gratitude for your heroic actions today. You saved countless lives, and we cannot thank you enough for your quick thinking and professionalism under pressure. We are aware of the allegations concerning inappropriate behavior by a member of our cabin crew and want to assure you that we take these claims seriously. We will be conducting a thorough investigation into the matter. Additionally, our CEO, Amanda Reeves, would like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss both your heroic efforts and how the airline can address issues of diversity and inclusion moving forward. If you are available, we would like to schedule this meeting at 10 a.m. at our Denver headquarters. Once again, thank you for everything you've done. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything in the meantime. Best regards, David Knox, Senior Operations Manager. Eric read the email twice, letting the words sink in. It was good that the airline was acknowledging the situation, but he had been down this road before. Too often, companies were quick to offer apologies or promises of change, but slow to follow through with concrete action. Still, the invitation to meet with Amanda Reeves was a step in the right direction. It wasn't every day that the CEO of a major airline wanted to have a conversation about diversity and inclusion, and Eric knew that if he handled the meeting correctly, he could potentially spark real change. The next morning, Eric woke early, his mind clear despite the exhaustion of the previous day. After a quick shower and breakfast, he made his way to the airline's headquarters, a sleek, modern building near the airport. As he entered the lobby, he was greeted by a young intern with bright eyes and a professional demeanor. Mr. Dawson, it's such an honor to meet you, she said with a warm smile. Ms. Reeves is expecting you. Please follow me. Eric thanked her and followed her to the elevator, which took them to the top floor of the building. As the elevator doors opened, Eric found himself in a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the airport below. At the head of the table stood Amanda Reeves, the airline's CEO. She was a sharp-looking woman in her early 50s, dressed in a tailored navy suit. Her expression was one of genuine gratitude as she stepped forward to greet Eric. Mr. Dawson, thank you so much for coming, she said, extending her hand. And thank you for what you did yesterday. You saved those passengers' lives, and we are all in your debt. Eric shook her hand firmly. I appreciate that, Ms. Reeves, but it wasn't just me. The co-pilot, David, did a great job, too. Amanda nodded. Of course. We'll be thanking everyone involved. But we're here today to talk about more than just the emergency landing. I understand that you've raised concerns about the behavior of one of our flight attendants, and I want you to know that we are committed to addressing this issue head-on. Eric appreciated her directness. I'm glad to hear that. What happened on the plane wasn't just about one person's bad attitude. It's part of a larger issue that exists in many industries, including aviation. I've been a pilot for over a decade, and I've faced subtle and not-so-subtle forms of discrimination throughout my career. What Kelly did yesterday was just the tip of the iceberg. Amanda listened intently, her expression serious. I agree with you, and I believe we have a responsibility to do better. That's why I wanted to meet with you to talk about how we can create meaningful change within our company. Eric leaned forward slightly, encouraged by her openness. I think the first step is acknowledging that diversity and inclusion can't just be buzzwords. It has to be built into the fabric of the company. That means better training for employees, but it also means looking at how we hire, promote, and support people of color and other underrepresented groups. Amanda nodded, taking notes as Eric spoke. We've already begun drafting new diversity initiatives, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can implement these changes in a way that actually makes a difference. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Eric offering suggestions on everything from recruitment practices to mentorship programs for young pilots from diverse backgrounds. Amanda was receptive to his ideas, and by the time the meeting ended, Eric felt cautiously optimistic that real progress could be made. As they stood to leave, Amanda offered Eric a sincere smile. "Thank you for your honesty and your insight. We're going to make sure this incident isn't just a momentary blip, but a catalyst for lasting change." Eric nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction. "That's all I'm asking for." After the meeting, Eric walked out of the building with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road to real change was long and often filled with setbacks, but today he had taken an important step. And while Kelly's behavior had been unacceptable, it had also opened the door for a larger conversation, one that Eric was determined to keep pushing forward. As he stepped outside and felt the sun on his face, Eric pulled out his phone and called Lisa. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "How did the meeting go?" Eric smiled. "It went well. Really well, actually. I think we're going to see some real changes." "I'm so proud of you," Lisa said softly. "Not just for what you did on that plane, but for everything else. For standing up for what's right." "Thanks, babe," Eric replied, his voice warm. "He'll be home soon. I can't wait to see you and the kids." As Eric ended the call, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced a day filled with challenges, both in the air and on the ground, but he had come out stronger for it. And now he was ready to take on whatever came next. Eric stepped out of the sleek corporate building, the meeting with Amanda Reeves still fresh in his mind. While the conversation had been productive, he knew that words and promises didn't always translate into real change. He had seen plenty of well-intentioned initiatives in the past, only for them to fizzle out once the immediate crisis had passed. Still, there was something about Amanda's genuine interest in making things right that gave him hope. As he made his way across the parking lot, Eric's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and email from David Knox, the airline's senior operations manager. The subject line read, "Subject update on Kelly Morgan." Eric hesitated for a moment before opening the message. "Dear Mr. Dawson, I wanted to follow up on the incident regarding Kelly Morgan. We have completed our initial investigation and had a meeting with her this morning. Kelly has acknowledged her behavior and has been deeply remorseful. After reviewing the situation, the airline has decided to suspend Kelly pending mandatory diversity training and counseling. We believe in giving our employees the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, but we also take incidents of discrimination seriously. We hope this decision demonstrates our commitment to addressing these issues, and we will continue to work with you and other employees to create a more inclusive environment. Thank you for your patience and for your ongoing contributions to this conversation. Best regards, David Knox, Senior Operations Manager." Eric read the email twice, processing the information. Suspension and mandatory training weren't the most severe consequences Kelly could have faced, but it was something. The fact that the airline had acted so quickly was a step in the right direction, though Eric couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. He didn't want Kelly's career to end over this, but he hoped that this experience would lead her to reflect deeply on her actions and change. With a sigh, he pocketed his phone and headed toward the hotel shuttle stop. He was about to return to his room and call Lisa when a voice called out behind him, "Eric." He turned around to see Kelly Morgan standing a few yards away, her face a mixture of apprehension and determination. She walked toward him, her steps hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether she had the right to approach him. Her usually confident posture was absent, replaced by something more fragile. "Can we talk?" Kelly asked, her voice quiet but sincere. Eric considered her for a moment. After everything that had happened, part of him wanted to walk away. He had already confronted her once, and she had apologized. What more could there be to say? But another part of him, perhaps the larger part, knew that avoiding this conversation wouldn't help either of them. If Kelly was seeking him out, it meant she was at least willing to take another step toward understanding. He nodded. "All right, let's talk." They moved to a quiet bench near the parking lot. The soft hum of passing cars, the only sound between them for a moment. Kelly sat down first, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "I just got out of a meeting with David Knox," Kelly said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've suspended me. He'll have to go through diversity training and counseling." Eric nodded but remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Kelly glanced up at him, her eyes full of regret. "I deserved it. All of it. The way I treated you, it wasn't just wrong, it was awful. And I can't stop thinking about it. I've been running through every moment of that flight in my head, wondering how I could have been so blind, how I could have made so many assumptions." Eric's expression softened slightly, but he didn't let her off the hook. "You know why you made those assumptions, Kelly? It wasn't just about me. It's about what's ingrained in our society. The things you've been taught to believe, even if you're not conscious of them." Kelly's eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them back. I know you're right. I grew up in a small town. Everyone around me looked the same, thought the same, and there wasn't much exposure to people who didn't fit into that mold. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I've been working in this industry for years. I should have known better. I thought I was better than that." Eric sighed, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "It's easy to think we're immune to prejudice when we haven't really been challenged by it. You've been in a position of privilege your whole life. It wasn't until you were faced with something outside your comfort zone that those biases surfaced." Kelly nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the ground. I can't believe it took something like this for me to wake up." Eric looked at her for a long moment. He could see the genuine remorse in her eyes, the weight of her regret pressing down on her. It would have been easy to stay angry, to hold on to the resentment he felt when she dismissed him so quickly on that plane. But Eric knew that anger, while justified, wouldn't lead to the kind of change he wanted to see in the world. If Kelly was willing to learn, maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point for her. "It's not too late to change," Eric said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The fact that you're here, having this conversation, shows that you're willing to grow. But you need to understand that this isn't something you fix overnight. It's a process." Kelly nodded again, her voice trembling. "I'm going to do everything I can. I promise." Eric leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Good. And make sure that promise is to yourself, not just to me." For the first time since the conversation began, Kelly smiled a small, tentative smile, but one filled with a sense of hope. "Thank you, Eric. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you for even talking to me." Eric nodded, standing up from the bench. "It's not about deserving. It's about doing better from here on out. We've all got work to do, Kelly." Kelly stood up as well, wiping her eyes and taking a deep breath. "I will. I won't forget this." As Eric turned to walk back toward the shuttle stop, Kelly watched him for a moment longer, then quietly walked away, her mind buzzing with the weight of what she had learned and the journey ahead. Eric sat quietly in the shuttle, his thoughts on the conversation with Kelly. It wasn't often that someone who had acted out of prejudice confronted their behavior so openly, but Kelly's willingness to learn gave him hope. At the same time, he knew that one person's transformation didn't change the entire system. There was still so much work to be done. As the shuttle pulled up to the hotel, Eric's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from Twitter. He frowned, opening the app, and was greeted by dozens of mentions, retweets, and comments. His name was trending, and as he scrolled through the posts, he realized that the story of the flight had gone viral. A video clip posted by a fellow passenger had been shared thousands of times. It showed Eric stepping out of the cockpit after the emergency landing, passengers clapping and cheering. The caption read, "When a hero rises in the most unexpected places." Thank you, Eric Dawson, for saving all of us. Eric felt a mix of emotions as he scrolled through the comments. Most were positive, people praising his calm under pressure and calling him a hero. But a few comments, buried under the praise, touched on the deeper issue. Isn't it sad that he had to save the plane to get the respect he deserved from the start? This shouldn't have happened in the first place. He was judged before he even got on the plane. Eric sighed, grateful that some people were acknowledging the full story, not just the heroic ending. But he also knew that the viral attention would be short-lived. In a few days, the world would move on to the next trending topic, and the deeper issues of racism and prejudice would fade from the public eye once again unless people like him kept pushing the conversation forward. That evening, Eric called Lisa. As her warm voice filled the line, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. "You've been all over the news," Lisa said, a smile in her voice. "You're trending on social media." "I know," Eric replied, his tone wry. "Not exactly what I expected when I booked a flight to Seattle." Lisa chuckled. "No, I don't think anyone expects to go viral for saving a plane. But I'm so proud of you, Eric. The kids are too." Maya was telling her friends at school today that her dad's a hero. Eric's heart softened at the thought of his daughter proudly talking about him. "I'm glad I made her proud," he said quietly. "But you know this isn't just about the landing. There's a bigger story here." "I know," Lisa replied, her voice growing serious. "And I know you're going to keep telling that story. That's who you are. You've always stood up for what's right." "I'll do my best," Eric said, his voice filled with determination. After hanging up the phone, Eric stood by the window, looking out at the Denver skyline once again. He thought about the passengers on that flight, about Kelly, about Amanda Reeves and her promises to bring about real change. He thought about his daughter Maya, and the world she would grow up in, a world that he hoped would be better, because of the steps people like him were willing to take. This was just the beginning. The journey toward equality and justice was long, but Eric knew that every step, no matter how small, brought them closer to the future they all deserved. Eric woke the next morning to a flood of notifications on his phone. News outlets, social media posts, and emails from well-wishers filled his screen. It seemed like everyone had something to say about the flight, and Eric found himself feeling overwhelmed by the attention. Despite his usual calm demeanor, being thrust into the spotlight wasn't something he had asked for. After a quick breakfast in his hotel room, he sat at the small desk, scrolling through the messages. Many people praised his heroism, while others, as he had feared, focused on the racial dynamics of the situation. Some were supportive, but a few comments exposed the ugly undercurrent of racism that still thrived online. Eric had long since learned to ignore those voices, but they were hard to fully shake. Amidst the noise, one email stood out, an invitation to speak at an upcoming aviation conference about diversity in the industry. The organizer had written a heartfelt message, explaining that Eric's story had inspired them to open up a new panel discussion about the challenges faced by minority pilots. Eric read the email twice, unsure how to feel. On the one hand, it was a positive step and opportunity to push the conversation forward. On the other hand, it weighed heavily on him that it took an emergency for people to start paying attention to the issues he and many others had been raising for years. He replied politely, thanking the organizer and agreeing to consider the offer once he returned home. Then, setting his phone aside, he leaned back in his chair and stared out the window. The sky was clear today, and for a moment, Eric felt a pull toward the air, longing to get back to the cockpit, to where he belonged. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. When Eric opened it, he found Tom Harris, the airline's head of ground operations, standing there with a serious but friendly expression. "Eric," Tom said, stepping inside, "I know you're probably tired of meetings by now, but Amanda Reeves and I wanted to discuss something important with you. Are you up for it?" Eric raised an eyebrow. "Of course. What's going on?" Tom gestured for Eric to follow him. They made their way downstairs to a smaller conference room where Amanda was already seated, reviewing some documents on her tablet. She looked up as they entered and smiled warmly. "Eric, thanks for coming," Amanda said, standing to greet him. "We won't take up too much of your time, but after our conversation yesterday, we've been thinking about how we can move forward, not just with what happened on the flight, but with the larger issues at hand." Eric sat down across from her, curious but cautious. "I'm listening." Amanda glanced at Tom before continuing. We've already decided to implement mandatory diversity training for all our staff, and we're revising our hiring and promotion policies to ensure they're more inclusive. But we don't want this to be just another corporate program that checks boxes and fades into the background. We want it to be meaningful. Eric nodded, appreciating her candor. That's a good start. What do you have in mind to make it meaningful? Tom leaned forward. We'd like you to play a key role in shaping these changes. Your insights as a pilot, as someone who has first-hand experience with the challenges faced by minority employees in this industry, would be invaluable. Eric's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the offer. You want me to help lead the diversity initiatives? Amanda smiled. Yes, but we're not asking you to give up flying. We know how much you love being a pilot. What we're proposing is a dual-role part of your time spent in the cockpit, and part of your time working with us as a diversity and inclusion consultant. You'd have the opportunity to guide these programs from within, ensuring that they're not just surface-level fixes, but lasting changes. Eric sat back, considering the offer. It was tempting a chance to help drive real change in an industry that had been slow to embrace diversity. But it also meant stepping into a more public role, something he wasn't sure he wanted. Flying had always been his passion, the place where he felt most in control. The idea of balancing that with the responsibility of representing a larger movement felt daunting. I appreciate the offer, Eric said after a moment, but I have to be honest, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I'm a pilot, not a corporate strategist. I've always preferred to let my work speak for itself. Amanda exchanged a glance with Tom before replying. That's exactly why we think you're the right person. Your work does speak for itself. Your experience, your integrity, and the way you handled that flight have already inspired so many people. You're someone people can look up to, someone who can bridge the gap between the employees on the ground and the changes we need to make at the top. Eric rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of their words. It's a big responsibility. It is, Amanda agreed, her tone sincere, and we won't pressure you into a decision. Take some time to think about it. But know that we believe your voice is essential in making sure these changes actually stick. Later that afternoon, Eric took a long walk around the outskirts of the hotel, his mind spinning with the possibilities. The invitation to help guide the airline's diversity initiatives was both an honor and a challenge. He had spent his career quietly navigating the complexities of being a black man in a predominantly white industry, but now he was being asked to step into the spotlight and confront those issues head-on. As he walked, Eric thought about the people he had met throughout his career: pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, many of whom had faced the same subtle and overt discrimination that he had. Some had quietly accepted it, while others had left the industry entirely, worn down by the constant microaggressions and barriers to advancement. He thought about Kelly, too, and the awkward, heartfelt apology she had given him. Her behavior on the flight had been reprehensible, but the fact that she had been willing to confront it and, hopefully, change was a small victory. It made Eric realize that while systemic change was necessary, individual growth was part of the process, too. That evening, Eric found himself sitting at a quiet cafe near the hotel, nursing a cup of coffee as the sun began to set. As the soft glow of twilight settled over the city, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Alex, the young flight attendant who had quietly supported him on the flight. Alex, hey, Mr. Dawson? I just wanted to say thanks again for what you did. Not just for landing the plane, but for everything. You really opened my eyes that day. Eric smiled at the message and typed a quick reply. Eric, thanks, Alex. I appreciate it. How are you doing? Alex, I'm doing well, but honestly, that flight made me think about a lot of things. I've seen stuff like what Kelly did before, but I didn't say anything. I just didn't want to rock the boat, you know, but after seeing how you handled it, I don't want to stay silent anymore. Eric's smile grew as he read the message. Alex was young, but he had a good heart, and it seemed like the events of the flight had sparked something in him. It was a reminder that real change didn't always happen in boardrooms, It happened in the hearts and minds of individuals. Eric, I'm glad to hear that, Alex. Speaking up takes courage, but it's important. Just remember, it's not about making noise for the sake of it. It's about making sure people are treated with respect and dignity. Alex, exactly. I'm going to do better. And I'm going to make sure I support my colleagues when they need it too. Eric put his phone away, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The decision he had to make was a difficult one, but moments like this hearing from people like Alex reminded him why it mattered. The work was far from over, but if he could inspire others to step up, maybe, just maybe, the ripple effects would be worth it. The next morning, Eric sat down with Amanda and Tom again, ready to give them his answer. He had spent the last 24 hours thinking about the offer, weighing the pros and cons, and considering what it would mean for his career and for the industry as a whole. I've made my decision, Eric said, his voice steady. I'll take on the role you're offering, but on one condition. Amanda raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's the condition? I don't want this to be just about me, Eric continued. I want to make sure that we're bringing in other voices, other pilots, flight attendants, ground crew people from all backgrounds who can share their experiences and help guide these changes. It can't be a one-man show. Amanda smiled, clearly pleased. I think that's a great idea. We can set up a committee of employees to ensure we're getting a wide range of perspectives. Tom nodded in agreement. It'll make the program stronger and more inclusive from the start. Eric felt a weight lift off his shoulders as he spoke. This wasn't just about him, it was about creating a lasting impact. And with the airline's commitment to change, there was a real opportunity to make things better for the next generation of employees. As the meeting wrapped up, Eric left the building feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be challenging. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of frustration. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like real progress was possible. When Eric returned to his hotel that evening, he called Lisa. As they talked about the day's events, he could hear the pride in her voice. You're going to do amazing things, Eric, Lisa said softly. I know this wasn't what you planned, but maybe it's exactly where you're supposed to be. Eric smiled, his heart full. Maybe it is. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, Eric looked out at the sky, the place where he felt most free. He had spent years navigating the clouds, but now he was ready to help others soar. A few weeks had passed since the dramatic events of Eric's flight and the subsequent whirlwind of media attention and corporate meetings. Life was beginning to settle back into a routine, though it was anything but the routine Eric had been used to. The role he had taken on as a diversity and inclusion consultant for the airline was proving to be both rewarding and challenging. He had spent long hours working with Amanda Reeves and a newly formed employee committee to draft real, actionable changes to company policies. But the work was far from over. This morning, however, wasn't about policy meetings or strategy sessions. It was about flying. Eric stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room, adjusting his tie and buttoning the crisp white shirt of his pilot's uniform. The familiar feel of the fabric against his skin brought a sense of calm and focus. After all the time spent in meetings, Eric was finally returning to the cockpit. The airline had cleared him for his first flight since the emergency landing, and he was eager to get back to what he loved most. As he grabbed his flight bag and headed for the door, Eric's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Lisa. Lisa, good luck today, Captain. You're going to crush it. The kids and I are cheering for you. Eric smiled, typing a quick reply. Eric, thanks, love. I'll call you when I land. Miss you guys. With that, he headed downstairs to meet the shuttle that would take him to the airport. As the shuttle wound through the quiet streets of the early morning, Eric took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened since that fateful flight. The challenges had been immense, but he had made it through. Now he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The airport was already bustling with activity when Eric arrived. He walked through the terminal, blending in with the other airline personnel heading to their gates. It felt good to be back in the familiar environment, the hum of travelers and the rhythmic beeping of luggage scanners filling the air. As he approached the crew desk, Eric spotted Melissa, the young flight attendant who had been on his previous flight. She was going through her pre-flight checklist, and when she looked up and saw Eric, her face broke into a bright smile. "Captain Dawson," she greeted warmly, standing up from her seat. "It's great to see you again." "Great to see you too, Melissa," Eric replied, shaking her hand. "You on this flight?" Melissa nodded enthusiastically. "Yep, I'm assigned to the first-class cabin again. Looks like we're working together." Eric smiled. There was something comforting about seeing a familiar face, especially after everything that had happened. Melissa had proven herself to be a capable and compassionate flight attendant during the emergency, and Eric was glad to have her on his crew. A few minutes later, Eric arrived at the gate, where the rest of his flight crew was assembling. His co-pilot for the day was Captain Jeff McAllister, a veteran pilot with salt-and-pepper hair and a calm, easygoing demeanor. Eric had flown with Jeff a few times before, and the two had always gotten along well. Jeff greeted him with a grin, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Good to see you, man. Heard you've been keeping busy with all that diversity work." Eric chuckled. "Yeah, it's been a lot, but I'm happy to be back in the air today." Jeff nodded, his expression understanding. "I bet. Well, today's a smooth one, just a quick hop to Chicago. Weather's clear, everything looks good. Let's make it a good flight." "Sounds perfect," Eric agreed, feeling the familiar excitement of takeoff building in his chest. As Eric and Jeff made their way into the cockpit, Eric couldn't help but take a deep breath as he settled into the captain's seat. This was where he belonged. The rows of buttons and switches, the hum of the instruments powering up, the vast expanse of sky ahead, this was his world. They completed the pre-flight checklist together, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed routine. The weather reports were favorable, and the ground crew had given them clearance to board the passengers. Soon enough, the first-class cabin began filling up, and Melissa and the other flight attendants welcomed the passengers with warm smiles. The atmosphere on this flight was calm, worlds away from the tense, life-threatening situation Eric had encountered on his previous flight. But even so, the events of that day weren't far from his mind. As the last of the passengers settled into their seats and the boarding process concluded, Eric received a signal from the cabin crew that they were ready for takeoff. He adjusted his headset and began the routine announcements. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Eric Dawson speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 5112, non-stop service to Chicago. We're looking at clear skies and a smooth ride today, with an expected flight time of just over 2 hours. We'll be getting underway shortly, so please sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." With the formalities out of the way, Eric and Jeff began their taxi to the runway. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit, and soon they were cleared for takeoff. Eric's hands moved confidently over the controls as the plane surged forward, lifting off the ground and climbing steadily into the sky. For the first time in weeks, Eric felt at peace. The familiar rhythm of the flight, the steady hum of the engines, and the vast open sky it was all a reminder of why he had chosen this career in the first place. No matter what challenges he faced on the ground, this was where he felt free. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Eric handed control over to Jeff, and the two pilots settled into an easy conversation. They talked shop about flight routes, upcoming schedules, and the quirks of different airports. But after a while, Jeff turned the conversation toward the recent events that had thrust Eric into the spotlight. "So," Jeff began, glancing at Eric with a knowing look, "you've had quite a few weeks, huh? That emergency landing, the news coverage, now you're spearheading all these changes with the airline." Eric shrugged modestly. "Yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind." "I'd say so," Jeff said with a chuckle. "You're a good pilot, Eric, and what you did on that flight was incredible. But I imagine all the attention has been easy." Eric nodded. "It's definitely been a lot to process. I didn't expect to be thrust into the middle of a diversity conversation like this, but it's important. If I can help make things better for the next generation of pilots and crew, it's worth it." Jeff leaned back in his seat, nodding thoughtfully. "You're doing good work, man, and I think the industry needs more people like you people who aren't afraid to speak up and push for change. It's been too long coming." Eric appreciated Jeff's support, and it reminded him that, while there were still barriers to break, there were also allies in the industry who understood the importance of the work ahead. A few hours later, Flight 5112 was nearing its destination. The descent into Chicago was smooth, the weather clear, and the wind light. Eric took control of the plane once more, guiding it toward the runway with practiced precision. As the wheels touched down with a gentle bump, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. This was the kind of flight every pilot hoped for: calm, uneventful, and smooth from start to finish. Once the plane taxied to the gate and the passengers began disembarking, Eric stood at the front of the cockpit, watching them exit. Many of them offered smiles or brief nods of thanks, but one passenger, a middle-aged black man wearing a suit, paused as he reached Eric. "Captain Dawson," the man said, his voice filled with respect. "I just wanted to say thank you. I read about what happened on that other flight, and what you did both in the air and afterward. It's inspiring. You're making a difference." Eric nodded, grateful for the man's words. "Thank you. I appreciate that." The man smiled and continued down the aisle, leaving Eric with a feeling of quiet pride. It wasn't the first time someone had recognized him since the incident, but every time it reinforced why he had accepted the challenge of leading the diversity initiatives at the airline. It wasn't just about him, it was about all the people who had felt marginalized or overlooked, who had been judged unfairly before they even had a chance to prove themselves. Back in the terminal, as Eric and his crew debriefed after the flight, Melissa approached him with a thoughtful expression. "Captain," she began, her voice tentative, "I've been thinking about what you said that day, about how we all have a responsibility to confront prejudice when we see it." Eric raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her tone. "Go on?" Melissa took a deep breath, clearly gathering her thoughts. "Well, I've been reading a lot about bias and discrimination in the workplace, and I realized that I haven't always done enough to speak up when I've seen things that didn't sit right. I want to change that." Eric smiled, seeing the determination in her eyes. "That's a good start, Melissa. The first step is recognizing the problem. The next step is doing something about it." Melissa nodded, her expression serious. "I will. I'm going to make sure that I'm part of the solution, not part of the problem." Eric clapped her on the shoulder, feeling a swell of pride. "That's all we can ask for. We all have to do our part." As the day wound down and Eric prepared for his return flight, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey toward change was just beginning, but already he could see the impact in himself, on his colleagues, and on the people around him. The work wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And now, with his feet firmly planted in both the cockpit and the larger movement for diversity and inclusion, Eric knew he was ready for whatever came next. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the airport, Eric glanced out at the sky, feeling a familiar sense of excitement and possibility. The world was still far from perfect, but he was committed to helping it get a little closer to the ideals he believed in. With a smile on his face and a sense of purpose in his heart, Eric boarded the plane for his next flight, ready to continue the journey, both in the air and on the ground. Eric returned home to Seattle later that evening, his mind buzzing with the events of the past few days. After so many weeks of meetings, navigating the media frenzy, and working on the airline's diversity initiatives, it felt good to step through his front door and into the comforting warmth of home. "Dad." His daughter Maya came racing toward him, her bright eyes filled with excitement. She threw her arms around him, her small frame squeezing tightly against his legs. "Hey, sweetie." Eric scooped her up in his arms and gave her a tight hug. "I missed you." Maya smiled brightly. "Mom told me you were flying again. Did everything go okay?" Eric chuckled. "Everything went great. Nice and smooth, just the way we like it." "Did you save the day again?" Maya asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Eric smiled gently, shaking his head. "Not this time. This time, everything was normal, and that's the best kind of flight." Maya giggled as he set her down, and she ran off to find her toys, leaving Eric standing in the entryway, the familiar scent of dinner cooking in the air. Moments later, Lisa appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Welcome home, Captain," Lisa said with a warm smile, stepping forward to kiss him on the cheek. "How was your flight?" "Smooth," Eric replied, taking her hand and pulling her into a gentle hug. "But it's even better to be home." Lisa rested her head against his shoulder for a moment, sighing contentedly. "We missed you, but I saw the news, everyone's still talking about you. The kids' school even called, asking if you'd be willing to come in and talk to the students about your career." Eric chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't know if I'm ready to be a local celebrity." Lisa grinned, playfully swatting his arm. "You've earned it. Besides, the work you're doing now, it's important. People want to hear from you." Eric exhaled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settle over him again. "I know. It's just sometimes it feels like it's all happening so fast. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that I'm in this position at all." Lisa pulled back slightly, looking up at him with understanding in her eyes. "You're doing great, Eric. You've always wanted to make a difference, and now you're getting the chance to do that in a big way." Eric nodded, appreciating her support more than he could express. "Yeah, I guess I just didn't expect it to happen like this." Lisa smiled softly, resting her hand on his chest. "Life doesn't always go according to plan, but I know you'll handle whatever comes your way." Eric kissed her forehead, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the steady presence Lisa had been through it all. "Thanks, babe. I don't know what I'd do without you." That evening after dinner, Eric found himself sitting in his study, looking through some of the documents related to the airline's diversity initiative. Amanda Reeves had been true to her word, pushing the changes forward with a sense of urgency that was both refreshing and rare in corporate environments. The newly established committee, made up of pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and management, had already made significant progress in crafting more inclusive hiring and promotion practices, as well as implementing training programs aimed at combating unconscious bias. But despite the positive steps forward, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much more work to be done. The airline's efforts were a start, but they weren't the end. He knew that real change, lasting change, would require a cultural shift that went beyond policies and procedures. As he sat there deep in thought, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from David Knox, the senior operations manager who had been working closely with him on the initiatives. "David, Eric, we've made great progress on the diversity programs, but I wanted to run something by you. We're thinking about expanding the scope of the program to partner with other airlines and industry leaders. Could you meet next week to discuss?" Eric stared at the message for a moment, surprised by the idea. Expanding the program to partner with other airlines, it was ambitious, but it made sense. The issues of racial inequality and lack of diversity weren't limited to one airline. They were industry-wide problems that needed a collective solution. He typed a quick reply, agreeing to the meeting. As he set the phone down, his mind began racing with possibilities. If they could get other airlines involved, the impact would be far greater than he had imagined. This wasn't just about making changes within one company, it was about setting a new standard for the entire industry. Eric leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of that realization sink in. For the first time since the day of the emergency landing, he felt a sense of clarity about what needed to happen next. He had a unique opportunity in front of him, one that went far beyond his own experiences. If he could help shift the entire aviation industry toward a more inclusive and equitable future, it would be a legacy worth leaving. The next day, Eric returned to the airline's headquarters for the meeting with David Knox and Amanda Reeves. As he walked into the sleek conference room, the city skyline visible through the large windows, he could feel the energy in the air. There was a sense of urgency in the room, a recognition that they were on the cusp of something big. "Eric, thanks for coming," Amanda greeted him as he took a seat. "I know you've been busy, but we've been working on something that we think could really take this initiative to the next level." David nodded in agreement, sliding a document across the table toward Eric. "We've been reaching out to other airlines and industry leaders, gauging their interest in forming a coalition to address these issues on a larger scale. The response has been overwhelmingly positive." Eric picked up the document, scanning it as David continued. "We're proposing a joint initiative and industry-wide commitment to increase diversity at all levels, from entry-level positions to leadership roles. It's not just about hiring more people of color Or women, it's about creating a more inclusive culture across the board. Eric nodded, impressed by the scope of the plan. This is ambitious. Amanda smiled. It is, but we think it's possible. We've already had conversations with two of the largest airlines in the country, and they're on board. We're also in talks with several regional carriers and industry organizations. David leaned forward, his expression serious. We want you to play a key role in this. You've already become a face for change in the industry, and your story has resonated with people. We think you'd be the perfect person to help lead this coalition. Eric's mind raced as he considered the offer. It was an incredible opportunity, but it was also a huge responsibility. Leading an industry-wide initiative would require a lot of time and effort that he wasn't sure he could balance with his flying schedule. But the chance to make a real, lasting impact on the aviation industry was too important to ignore. He set the document down, meeting David and Amanda's gazes. I'm honored that you'd think of me for this. But if I'm going to be involved, I need to make sure we're not just talking about surface-level changes. This has to be real, substantive work. Amanda nodded, her expression serious. That's exactly what we're aiming for. This isn't about PR or checking boxes. We're committed to making sure this initiative has teeth. David added, we're planning to bring in outside experts, people who specialize in diversity and inclusion, work to help guide the coalition. And with your experience as both a pilot and someone who's lived through these challenges, you'd be an essential part of shaping how we move forward. Eric leaned back in his chair, absorbing their words. This was a rare opportunity, one that had the potential to create meaningful, lasting change. But it would also require stepping even further into the public eye, becoming a more visible figure in the industry's fight for equity. After a long pause, he nodded. I'm in. But I'll need to figure out how to balance this with my flying schedule. I'm not giving up the cockpit. Amanda smiled. We wouldn't expect you to. Well, work with your schedule and make sure you have the flexibility you need. David added, we'll get the logistics figured out. For now, let's focus on getting this initiative off the ground. As the meeting continued, the conversation shifted to the practical steps needed to launch the coalition. They discussed potential partners, key goals, and the timeline for rolling out the initiative. Eric contributed his insights, drawing on both his personal experiences and his knowledge of the industry. By the time the meeting ended, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. Walking out of the building later that afternoon, Eric couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. The future wasn't just about reacting to problems, it was about creating solutions. And now, with the support of the airline and industry leaders, he had the chance to do exactly that. That evening back home in Seattle, Eric sat on the porch with Lisa, enjoying the quiet of the evening as the sun dipped below the horizon. He told her about the meeting, about the coalition, and the opportunity ahead. You're going to change the whole industry, Lisa said, her voice filled with pride. Eric smiled, shaking his head modestly. I'm just one person. But if we can get the whole industry to commit to these changes, then yeah, maybe we can make a real difference. Lisa leaned her head on his shoulder. I know you will. You've always been a catalyst for change, whether you realize it or not. Eric sighed contentedly, resting his hand on hers. I just want to make sure Maya and the next generation don't have to go through the same struggles we did. If we can create a better environment for them, then it's all worth it. Lisa squeezed his hand, her voice soft but firm. You already are. As the night settled in around them, Eric gazed up at the stars, feeling a deep sense of peace and purpose. The path ahead was clear, and while it wouldn't be easy, he knew that he was ready to take it on. The journey toward a more inclusive, equitable future was just beginning, and Eric was determined to see it through. Months passed since Eric Dawson's fateful flight and the decision to take on a dual role both as a pilot and a leader in the airline's diversity and inclusion initiative. The changes were already beginning to take root, not only at his airline, but also across the industry. His story, once the subject of viral news and social media buzz, had become a catalyst for lasting change. Eric found a new rhythm between flying and his consulting work, carefully balancing both passions. the industry-wide coalition had gained momentum, and with the help of Amanda Reeves, David Knox, and other allies, the aviation industry had begun committing to real diversity. Goals revising hiring practices, creating mentorship programs, and ensuring that leadership reflected the diversity of their employees. Despite the heavy responsibility, Eric never lost sight of the cockpit. Flying still gave him the peace and clarity that no boardroom or conference could provide. It was where he felt most at home, and it kept him grounded through the rapid changes happening around him. One afternoon, Eric was on a flight back to Seattle when he noticed a familiar face in the first-class cabin. Kelly Morgan, the flight attendant from that life-changing day. Kelly had been reinstated after her suspension, having completed mandatory training and counseling. She had reached out to Eric more than once since then, determined to show him and herself that she was changing. As he greeted passengers, Kelly approached him, her demeanor humble yet confident. "Captain Dawson," she said, her voice calm, "I just wanted to say thank you again for giving me a chance to learn. I've been working hard, and I think I'm finally starting to get it." Eric nodded, offering her a smile. "It's a journey, Kelly. What matters is that you're committed to it." Kelly smiled, her relief visible. "I am, and I hope I can be part of the change you're leading." Eric appreciated her sincerity, recognizing that her growth was a small part of the larger transformation he had hoped for in the industry. Kelly's story wasn't just about redemption. It was about what could happen when people were given the tools to confront their biases and make meaningful changes. After the flight, Eric received an invitation from his daughter Maya's school. They had heard about his work, and the students wanted to hear from him about his career and his journey. It wasn't the first time Eric had been asked to speak to young people, but this time it felt more personal. Maya had been proud to tell her friends about her dad, the pilot who not only saved lives, but was also making sure the skies were open to everyone, no matter their background. The day of the school visit, Eric stood in front of a classroom filled with eager faces. Maya sat in the front row, her eyes wide with pride. Eric began his story, starting with his love for flying, the struggles he had faced as a black pilot, and how one emergency flight had changed everything. "I wasn't always sure I'd make it this far," Eric told the students. "There were people who doubted me because of what I looked like, where I came from. But I learned something important along the way. What matters most is your character, your abilities, and your willingness to keep going, even when the odds are against you." One student raised her hand. "What's the hardest part about being a pilot?" Eric smiled. "It's not always about flying the plane. Sometimes the hardest part is believing in yourself when the world is telling you that you don't belong. But I'm here to tell you that you do. If you work hard and stay true to yourself, you can go anywhere." After the talk, Maya ran up to him, hugging him tightly. "Dad, that was awesome," she exclaimed. "I'm so proud of you." Eric knelt to her level, smiling as he looked into her eyes. "I'm proud of you too, Maya. One day, you're going to be out there making a difference too. You know that, right?" Maya nodded with determination. "I want to be just like you." Eric's heart swelled. "You can be even better than me." As time passed, the changes Eric had helped implement continued to ripple throughout the industry. Pilots from diverse backgrounds were being hired and promoted more frequently, and flight crews were becoming more inclusive and reflective of the passengers they served. Eric had become a mentor to many young pilots, helping them navigate the challenges he had once faced alone. One day, after another routine flight, Eric was approached by a young, nervous-looking pilot, Elena Rodriguez, one of the scholarship recipients from the diversity initiative he had helped launch. She had recently completed her training and was on her first day as an official commercial pilot. "Captain Dawson," Elena said, her voice trembling with excitement, "I just wanted to say thank you. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you and the work you've done. You made me believe that this dream was possible." Eric smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "You earned this, Elena. You've worked hard. All I did was make sure the doors stayed open." Elena's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "But you showed me that I belong, that we all belong." As Eric watched her walk away, ready to begin her own journey in the sky, he realized something important. The legacy he was leaving was just about him. It was about the countless lives he had touched, the pilots, flight attendants, and crew members who would carry the torch forward, ensuring that the industry continued to grow and evolve. Back at home one evening, Eric sat on the porch with Lisa, watching the stars twinkle above the Seattle skyline. Maya had gone to bed, and the house was quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. "You've done so much," Lisa said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you." Eric smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said softly. Lisa chuckled. "I know. But you did the hard part." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sky. "So, what's next?" Lisa asked. "You've accomplished so much already." Eric thought for a moment, his gaze still fixed on the stars. "I think it's time to let others lead the way," he said. "You'll keep flying, keep mentoring, but it's their turn, now the next generation." Lisa smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you'll be right there with them, won't you?" Eric nodded. "Always." As the night deepened, Eric felt a profound sense of closure. His journey had taken him through challenges he hadn't anticipated, but in the end, it had led him to something greater than he could have imagined, a legacy of change, hope, and possibility. He had helped open the skies for everyone, and now it was time for the next generation to take flight. As we bring this journey to a close, we're reminded of the importance of standing up for what's right, believing in yourself, and pushing for change even when the odds are against you. If you found Eric's story inspiring and want to hear more powerful and uplifting stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more journeys of resilience, growth, and triumph. Don't forget to leave a comment below with your thoughts, and share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that no dream is out of reach. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more.